Sheena Mason, how are you?
I'm well. How are you, Kevin?
Good, good. We haven't talked in a while.
It feels like it's been a long time, yes.
It has. I think you were under the weather a few weeks ago. We had to postpone, but hopefully you had a restful holiday
Yes, thank
break and
you.
are back to it.
Yes, thank you. I am feeling better.
Good. Should probably turn on my light because my lighting in here is that's. I'm a little bit brighter now.
Yeah, you
Good.
are.
All right. That's nice. Yeah, we were just kind of talking before we recorded, and you were telling me about a recent very recent publication, and that you're getting some backlash on social media. Say it ain't so, but that's a great segue because we're going to be talking about all things social media and conversation and all the vitriol that goes on. So why don't we start there? That's a great place to start.
Yeah, so I have an essay out in the Journal of Free Black Thought. It's a journal on Substack, and the it's getting a lot of feedback, and we're getting a lot of interest. The journal founders actually contacted me and told me that it's getting more attention than basically anything they've published, which
Wow.
I take to be a good thing. And at first, the comments all seemed very reasonable, right? Because you can comment on journals in Substack right underneath, and you can, and also, of course, if you're not using Twitter, my friend told me you're not doing it right. You're not advertising. So um,
I'm not doing it right. Just preview. I'm not doing it right.
so so Free Black Thought and myself, we're both on Twitter, so we're both advertising the publication, and the tweet takes off. I haven't had a viral tweet ever. I've only started using Twitter for the last 2.5 months after I had the conversation with my friend. So this is my first tweet that gets actual attention. And I noticed once it got past a certain number of likes and retweets, then the
Hmm.
hateful replies started coming in. And this morning
Hmm.
I woke up to it was a tweet. It was something to the effect of, white people still don't like you, even though you took time to write this crap for them. You're
Hmm.
anti-black. Dot
Hmm.
dot dot
Hmm.
dot dot.
Yeah.
So that was the tweet that's standing out in my mind as the most. I don't know if the word hateful is it, but the most sort of self-projecting type of tweet that a person could do with the intent to harm the other person. But as you can
Right.
see, I'm pretty cheerful about it because
Yeah.
listen, I'm kind of the belief that when the hateful stuff starts coming in, then you know you're doing something right. Um,
That's a good way to look at it. That's a good way to look. So let's go back and so give me the synopsis. Give us the synopsis of this article so that we can better understand kind of why there's any sort of backlash and what that comment meant in relation to the article.
so it lays out my theory of racelessness. I talk about the six philosophies of race very succinctly. I talk a little bit about the background of the creation of the concept of race as we now think of it in the United States. I give my coining of my spelling for the words racism, anti-racism, and the title is something like "Theory of Racelessness: A Case for Anti-Racism."
Right.
Um, to eliminate racism, we must eliminate race. So that gives you a sort of a overview of what the piece is actually about. And then I
Right.
close with something provocative like, one question remains: am I black? And
Mm, mm.
if you insist to place me on the racialist hierarchy, then um then that's on you or something like
Mm.
that. But who are you to tell me who I am? It's something of that effect.
Yeah.
So
And for those who are interested in your ideas on racelessness, of course, I can link to that to the article. But we also have two conversations before this one where we go over kind of in pretty good detail, kind of what that is, why you think the idea of race should be eliminated rather than that we should see it as a social construction, stuff like that. So we go through all that. Um, yeah, so it's interesting that and that seems to be the general trend is an article will get a lot of kind of positive or reasonable comments, and then after a certain tipping point, that's when the vitriol will come out. That's when people are not only going to say you're wrong, but like this person did, um, in some ways go beyond you're wrong and say, here's why you're either stupid and a dupe or you're evil, or like,
Or you're racist. If you're
or you're,
anti-black, you're
yeah,
racist, right?
right, right.
It's
I
makes me
wonder why
laugh.
that is. Why is it that why is it that an article will go through a certain comment period where it's like kind of, oh, this is pretty reasonable, and then only after a while it seems to produce that. I don't know if you have any ideas on that.
Well, I think it's because if the publication came out and nobody paid attention to it and it just died in obscurity, then people wouldn't feel it was a threat. So they wouldn't feel inclined to come out and try to lambast and silence you. Because at the end of the day, I
Hmm.
think even if it's on a subconscious level, people who are the loudest and in many ways the meanest on these different social media spaces are the same people who want you to shut up. And
Hmm.
so for a weaker minded person, that person not being me, those kinds of comments could be hurtful enough to make me just go in a tailspin and doubt myself and just stop talking, right? Like stop amplifying my knowledge. I think that's the hope and the intent. And actually, one of the founders of Free Black Thought, Eric Smith, I met with him a few months ago. We had an unrelated conversation, but he told me at that time the people who are the loudest and the people who are going to be the loudest, if you haven't started already receiving some hateful commentary, it's going to come. And I want you to hear this when I say, when it comes, their primary objective is to intimidate you into silence. And
Hmm.
I hope you don't fall for it. So
Yeah,
I
I think
really
that's
think
all.
that's what it's about.
I mean, I think it's also really insightful on your part, though, that it's not just about intimidating you into silence. It's about undermining your credibility in the eyes of others so that no one else will take you seriously either, which is why it's not just you're wrong and here's why, but I'm going to take your point seriously enough to try to tell you why you're wrong. It's I want to show other people that you're unreliable.
It has to be
And
public. Hmm.
that's either you're stupid and a dupe, which in this case it sounds like they're saying, "Oh, you're being duped by white people." So don't pay attention to Sheena because she's being duped by white people. Or it would be you're evil, or it would be like you're racist and you can't realize how wrong you are. But those comments are, I mean, they're directed towards you, like ostensibly,
Yeah.
but they're really directed towards other people.
Yes.
Hey, everyone else, don't take this person seriously, and here's why they're unreliable.
Exactly. That's why I'm convinced. That's why I remain convinced that that kind of messaging really only comes after you've gotten a certain amount of attention.
Yeah,
Because
yeah, yeah,
otherwise, what's the point if people? But once you see like so many people are taking it seriously, retweeting it, saying how great of and insightful of an essay it is, and all this other stuff, now somebody needs to come and in a very public manner tell you you're racist, which is the same as if I'm looking at a retweet of the same essay and I look at the comments and I see a racialized black person, which that was the person in this case, at least from the picture, you never know because it's Twitter, but the picture is a racialized black man saying you're anti-black. And we know, especially in this space of all things anti-racism, that the fear people have, right or wrong, is of being racist or being found out to be racist, right? Or to be labeled racist. And so if you're reading the essay, you come across the tweet and you see that kind of feedback from a so-called black person, it is going to put some amount of alarm bells, in your mind, depending on who you are. I like to think
yeah.
more people are can see through that kind of thing at this point, but you never know in
Mm,
this day and age, especially with how media works.
yeah, it's like there's a gap between I would like to think that people are capable of, and like I'm looking out and seeing what people seem to be capable of, and there's this big difference between those two. I mean, one of the reasons I propose the idea of talking about conversation in the social media age as a topic is because I've found myself increasingly just disaffected with it. Part of it is that it just seems so futile. Like the only people you're ever going to convince seem to be the people who already agree with the position you have. Like if you expect anything more than that, there's no social media platform where you'll get that. And then secondly, it's become boring to me. I just noticed that I was just it was one afternoon I'd spent a fair amount of time conversing with people on social media. I was like, it seems to be boring. Like I know what people are going to say. I know what people are going to say in response. I know what the response to that's going to be. I feel like I'm caught in these situations where I'm basically having the same conversation over and over with people. Um, and I was never a big user to begin with. It was really Facebook and my several failed Twitter attempts. So I guess I use what could be called old people social media, I guess. But it doesn't seem to it just doesn't seem to provide a whole lot of value at this point. I don't know. I guess the best way to frame it may be like I'm going to guess that there's a fair age difference between us. I'm in my early 40s. I don't ask people's ages. If you ever want to disclose that, you could, but obviously, uh, it's well within your rights not to do that. But it seems like I'm on the downswing and you're on the upswing. So this is an interesting. This could be two different angles here. I don't know.
Yeah, that it's interesting to hear your perspective, and unsurprising because I'm sure you're not alone in your in those sentiments. I actually view social media as part of my research, so it helps me to maintain interest. Though I will say, so I'm very new to Twitter. Within the last 3 months, that's when I started actually using a Twitter account that I created in April of 2021, but
Hmm.
never did a tweet or followed a tweet or anything. My friend told me because of theory of racistness, he saw it as a solution to the stuff that's going on. So he had a whole meeting with me and was like telling me about Twitter and saying, if you're not on Twitter, you're not advertising and really you're not doing it right. So I trust him implicitly. I mean, he's just brilliant. So I trust him. So I started using Twitter. And sure enough, it is the case that whereas on Facebook or LinkedIn or Instagram, it's a very slow grow. Like it's painfully slow. You're lucky to get a
Yeah.
follower a week. It doesn't seem to matter how brilliant your content is, right? It's so slow. Um, well, on Twitter, we went from 0 followers to over 500 now in 2.5 months, which is it. That's probably uncommon. The publication helped. I mean, just yesterday alone, which was the day of the Free Black Thought publication, something like over 150 followers to my Sheena account and the Theory of Racistness account.
Hmm.
So if you're if you're doing it right, because there is a sort of formula to it, you can grow really really fast, and your ideas can spread like wildfire, for better or for worse. um,
Yeah.
I think that the implementation of something called Twitter Spaces is a place where I go in and I like to learn from people, because ultimately at the end of the day, I'm always testing my ideas, and part of how I test it is actually look at what people are saying on social media, and does it vibe with the sort of general impressions I get about how people think about certain things, and yada yada yada. And that to me can admittedly get a little boring, because yeah, I mean, nobody is really saying anything groundbreaking or unexpected. It's all more of the same stuff, and I do get tired of it sometimes. But I still engage, I still look, I still listen. But more than that, I think I've also expanded my focus to make sure that I'm a voice that's an alternative to the nonsense, because I know I'm not the only person. I know it's a small circle, right, of people who are working to abolish the concept of race, but there are people who are working to abolish the concept of race. And so I use it for networking. I've been invited on other people's podcasts. We didn't meet that way, but we met on YouTube, so it's kind of
Well,
similar.
it's similar.
Um,
Yeah.
I get invited to radio shows, like all kinds of doors open that otherwise wouldn't be open. A literary agent contacted me. There are definitely some upsides. I got in touch
Yeah.
and learned of Free Black Thought because of Twitter. There are definitely some upsides, but I think you have to be interested in taking advantage of those, and you have to be willing to to grapple with the downsides too, which can be a sort of yeah, just like not wanting to fall into contentment and not being simulated in certain ways in terms of ideas.
Yeah.
That's a real thing. Oh, and also I will say I'm 37. I turned 38 in June. So
Okay.
I'm
So
not
we're not
so
that far apart.
far. Yeah, I'm not so much younger, but I appreciate the compliment though, 'cause-
Like, well, I mean, because I remember, I am of the last generation. I always tell students this, and at this point, they're so much younger than me that they sort of chuckle at it. But um, I'm of the age that remembers what it was like not to grow up with social media, and if I'm being honest, not to grow up without the internet. Like, I remember in college, a few edgy professors were like, "You can email me your projects," and we're like, "No, I'm just going to stop by your office because I don't do that." It was really only after college that started happening, and then it was in must have been it was I think my late 20s, early 30s when like Facebook and Twitter kind of really came out. And in some ways, like you, I was introduced to Facebook through when I went to do my PhD in education. There was like a graduate student Facebook group and all that stuff, and it's like stay networked with everybody and this will be great. And so that's when I got into it. But yeah, I don't know what it's like to grow up with social media. I don't know what that's like. But I mean, another reason that I thought we should have a discussion about this was because I teach an intro to diversity class for undergraduates. And we talk about kind of all the hot button diversity areas, diversity of race, diversity of sexuality, gender identity, things like that. And several students throughout the early part of the semester started kind of making comments here or there, whether it was in the class or to me after class, where they're like, it's pretty much impossible to talk about these things in any genuine way on social media spaces. You just can't do it. Even the social media spaces they're using, Snapchat, Instagram, um, just you can't do it. Um, and the more I heard that from students, whether again privately or publicly in class, the more I was like, well, maybe this is something we should talk about in class. Because I remember the goal of social media, at least the stated goal, was that this is going to introduce us to more and more diversity and we'll become more open minded because we'll hear like different people and everyone will have a voice, unlike what's happened before. And this will be great. It'll kind of open up the world. And in some ways, I think it has done some of that. But in other ways, it's like it's really polarized people. It's done almost the opposite of what it was supposed to do. So then the question is like, why? So I started researching that and I brought in some of the findings to students and we had some really interesting conversations about it. And before you know it, this became one of the themes of the class. It was like, how does social media affect things like how we see other people who are different from us? Does it make us more accepting and tolerant? Does it make us less quick to pass judgment? No, it actually kind of makes us more quick to pass judgment. It seems like stereotypes are more likely thanks to our social media experience. It's
but I think that's largely because, well, first of all, it's interesting because earlier you said it was something to the effect of when you were sort of doing the social media thing, it often felt like you were just talking to or with people who already agree with you. And so then it's kind of like, okay, what's the point? Because you're in your own sort of echo chamber. But then based off of what you just said, it strikes me that if students find it hard to have meaningful conversations about important topics and things like that on social media, it strikes me that they're not talking to people who already agree with them then, because the lack of meaning comes into play when you say something and then people come and sort of like want to social media fight with you, right? About whatever it is that you said or how you said it, that sort of thing. And so I think there's a little bit of muddiness that I want to emphasize, because I've heard the sentiment that you initially expressed before too, where um I had like a work meeting, and folks were talking about this. Some people feeling like the best way to market is to talk to preach to the choir in a way, to your own choir, but then somebody else was sort of disagreeing, saying, no, I actually think you should be speaking to the people who aren't in the choir yet. um, or you should do both. You shouldn't just exclude other people. And I find myself feeling in a unique place, in the sense that my ideas by and large aren't accepted by almost all people, like they, because they don't
Yeah.
even know, they're not even educated in what I bring to the table enough to really have an opinion, and people's initial response is often disagreement until they fully understand what I'm talking about, and then they feel compelled, because again there is this fear of they don't want to be on the wrong side of the conversation. um and so my choir is admittedly very, very small. There's like five people, and everyone knows everyone's name, and everyone thinks to connect you with that one other person, and
Mm.
it's like it's very small. It feels like a very small world on Twitter, especially. um and so, I embrace holding my feet to the fire and talking to people who aren't going to be familiar with the ideas that I'm expressing, and might
Mm.
not have heard them coming really from anywhere else. Um, and in that way, I think the benefit of social media can be to sharpen one's toolkit. You can have a meaningful conversation. You can have meaningful conversations on social media, but oftentimes we, the participants, or the sort of initiator of any conversation, are the ones who are can be unwilling to have the meaningful, underlying
Mm.
meaningful part, right? If somebody disagrees with what we say, then we might get on the defense, as opposed to actually trying to understand where they're coming from, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And so I think what social media can do is, if teachers and educators, especially as college professors, are aware of the sort of upsides to social media, as well as how students can perceive the downsides, I think integrating those skills of being able to have meaningful conversations, and being able to sort of put on the back burner even just a little bit one's emotions, an attachment to one's own ideas, to really understand where a person is coming from, not necessarily for the other person, but for yourself, because it helps you grow as a human being. It helps you grow your ideas, and in my instance, it helps me know how to package the information in a way that's received better and better and better across time.
Mm.
I think that cannot be devalued. And the thing that I hear from my students mostly about social media, though, isn't really anything to do with that. It's more the fact that part of the roadblocks to having more meaningful conversations isn't just the personal, it's the fact that Google, so all of the software that's on the phones, is going to present you with information and other pages that you would agree with. It's going to present you with your choir. And
Yeah.
so, and many people don't know to look for what other people are saying.
Yeah.
And in that way, I think that is the downside, because we don't encourage young people, we don't even often encourage ourselves to seek out the other voices that are part of whatever conversation. That's why you have you know the divisiveness that comes around all of these cases that get, because when I think of media, I think of social media, yes, but I also think of, like news outlets and things, because they infiltrate social media spaces. um, and they help people create really, really strong opinions that they feel wed to, and then they don't expose you to the other side. I think
Right.
I think that is a skill that our students need to really learn, that we need to learn for ourselves. Like, we need to question everything, and we need to know to go seek out those other voices, so that the algorithm presents you with a rounder, you know plate or menu of voices, as opposed to a single perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned some really interesting stuff there. I guess this dialogue may end up being you being the optimist and me being the pessimist, and us trying to convince each other on that. Um, because one of the interesting things that you said there was that talk about the incentive structures. So when I was doing research for my students, because I really thought this maybe I should bring in some stuff about this, I really looked at two voices who are kind of trying to explain why social media and regular media are so kind of divisive and prone to stereotyping. Um, and the two voices are in the social media space, a technologist named Jaron Lanier, and then in the regular media space, a journalist named Matt Taibbi. I don't know if you've kind of looked at their work or heard of them, but if not, listeners should kind of look at what they say. So Jaron Lanier's criticisms of social media are in a book called 10 Arguments for Deleting Your Social Media Accounts. And then Matt Taibbi's critiques of regular media are in a book called Hate Incorporated. And you can see a lot of, if you look at, like, they do a lot of stuff through YouTube and other places kind of airing these arguments. And they have everything to do with incentives. You're right that a lot of it is that we're kind of partitioning ourselves. But I think what they would say is that, yeah, Google, New York Times, all these companies, Fox News, they sort of know that there's a great incentive. If they want to keep you engaged, the best thing to do is make you a partisan. It turns out that we really like being in these groups of people that agree with us. And we really hate being confronted with intelligent pictures of the other side. So Jaron Lanier's work basically comes down to saying Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, even TikTok, they are monetized, obviously not by the users. They're monetized by advertisers. And because of that, their incentive is to keep you engaged, no matter how that works. They don't care to keep you engaged in a happy way if it turns out that enraging you will actually be better. And it actually turns out that enraging you is better. So what Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok will do is feed you a stream of stuff that not only confirms your beliefs, because that's like a drug, but the opposite enrages you at look how stupid the other people are. Look at how evil everything is. You're on the side of right. They want to convince you that you're on the side of right. So not only are they showing you stuff that you'll agree with on your feed that confirms you, but they'll show you stuff that confirms your idea that the other side is evil. So for, let's say, the progressive left, that's going to be convincing you that racism is everywhere, fascism is everywhere, it's a huge threat. For the right wing, that's going to be confirming your idea that communism is everywhere and socialism is everywhere, and that, right? So it's almost this mirror opposite thing. And for Matt Taibbi, he points out that really with this, it was really Fox News was the one that figured out that the formula is, in an age of cable news where everyone, where like you don't have to appeal to everybody, just like you did on network TV. Said really their strategy was, let's pick a market and dominate it. They said, let's pick 50 plus people who are like conservative, and let's feed them a steady stream of stuff that will keep them coming back to us. And then they did that and it worked really well. And then, all the other cable news outlets started doing that and it worked really well. So, but they picked MSNBC picked the opposite. Let's pick like kind of liberal / progressive folks who are in their 50s and let's feed them a stream of stuff. And then really, I mean, it's just the internet accelerated that. So if you want to have a viable news outlet, you need to pick a certain market that believes a certain thing and let's feed them the stuff that they want. So, Matt's point is that it doesn't take long before every news article becomes like a political litmus test. Whereas the people who are going to read it are either the people who agree with you and they just want to see confirmation, or people who don't agree with you but will see you as like the enemy, and it will just reinforce their belief that, see, that other side is dangerous. So it's this really interesting feedback loop. And one of Jaron's points that I thought was interesting for the class was that he said that basically in some ways you become the algorithm. And by that, he means that if the algorithm wants to keep you engaged, there's two ways to do it. The algorithm can become better at predicting you, or the algorithm can nudge you to become more like it. And he says in reality, both of those are going on. And a lot of it is you become more like the algorithm because you're fed a certain stream of stuff that nudges your tastes just a little bit to become more like the algorithm. And now the algorithm can predict you better. Not because it became better, but because you became flatter. And that's really interesting and disturbing.
Yeah, that is interesting and disturbing because something that stood out to me is how anger is motivating.
Yep.
And isn't that sad? But it is. It is one of the probably one of our strongest human emotions, right? And so there is a way in which I think anyone with common sense, I would like to think anyone with common sense can see how this works in the real world, right? How people are really driven by anger and the kind of hilarity of it. It probably would be more hilarious if it wasn't so bad for our society, but I find humor everywhere. The
If
hilarity.
George Schuyler were writing it, if to go back to our previous conversation, if George Schuyler were writing it, it would be freaking hilarious. He would find a way to make it the funniest thing you've ever
He
seen.
would. That's probably why I love him so much. So the hilarity of it is like, okay, let's take the Kyle Rittenhouse case, for example. So people who tend to lean right, conservatives, are were for Kyle's acquittal, right? And they were outraged at mostly the left's response to the Rittenhouse case. And the response is like, wow, look at those progressives, they're so stupid. Right? Like,
Right.
and it was really, but it wasn't ever just a matter of fact thing. Like, there was so much anger coming from people on the right toward the left about the response. People on the left were really angry with people on the right because they're like, of course this isn't self-defense, this is white supremacy in real, embodied, and all of this other stuff, and so much anger and disdain for the other side. And what's the hilarious part is both sides are having basically the same reaction, but they're just drawing different conclusions. But they're reacting the same, and then they're accusing the other side of the same thing that they're doing, and but seemingly not cognizant of the fact that they're doing the same thing they're accusing the
Yeah.
other side of
Yeah.
doing. And
Right. Well, it's in the nature of being a cult member that you don't think you're a cult member.
oh
Right.
my gosh, oh, that was like a sucker punch, because around the mulberry bush we go. Like, this is this sort of psychology of, and the irony of it all. And then somebody like myself, who's like just an observer a lot of the time, because I'm really learning how people are thinking about these things. I'm primarily interested in epistemology, how people come to certain knowledge. And so I'm observing all of this stuff, and I'm just like shaking my head, and also scratching my head and trying not to pull my hair out because of the venom and the ad hominem attacks that are coming on all sides, and the sort of infrequent um happening of people who have differing opinions about the same thing actually having a conversation that looks civil and also meaningful. It's a thing. But it also strikes me that I think part of how media sets us up is to inspire us to be pessimistic and to think that more people are on the extreme ends of the spectrum than not. Because it
Hmm.
strikes me that the
Yeah.
loudest voices on social media are the people who are on the further, they're basically on the polls or closer to the polls, and that the average citizen is really closer to the center. And maybe that's me being naive, and maybe that's me being very optimistic, maybe blindly optimistic, but I think my conclusion for that is because what I see on the internet and what I see in real life, it's often two different things, right? It's like I find people to be very reasonable in reality. Um and I have the good fortune of meeting a lot of people through theory of racelessness, and I teach my students philosophies of race. these are concepts that they've never been presented with. It flies in the face of what they come into the class believing and thinking they're going to learn. And by the end of the semester, they are completely transformed for the better, and they're questioning everything, and they feel happier because they're not weighed down by the nonsense that they often come into the class carrying. So I find people in reality to be very, very reasonable, but then you go to a place like Twitter and you see the venom and the unwillingness to actually engage in dialogue. And I think I think it's kind of a setup. And I think that's where
Hmm.
you start to get linkages, especially for young people, an increased amount of depression and things like that because of their persistent engagement with social media. I think it's a setup. And I think, like you said, at the root of the setup is capitalism. It is the fact that people are monetizing anger, they're monetizing divisiveness, they're monetizing people being on their side because they know what's going to get the clicks. They know what's going to bring them back to their content. And so it's like this strange sort of matrix for me of like seeing what happens on social media versus talking with people in real life and
Yeah.
actually learning that more people are reasonable. And I think that's where my optimism gets maintained because I get to have both experiences.
Hmm. Yeah, like this isn't the real world. Like when you go on Twitter, you're fully aware that like this may or may not reflect the divisions that actually exist elsewhere.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, my rule for social media right now, and really at this point, I'm not on Twitter. It's so really it's really only Facebook at this point. My rule is that I will comment on people's posts and threads if I feel like it's a worthwhile thing. If it's something I want to suck a certain amount of time into, um, I will do it, and I will not post anymore. Like I've wanted to post, I've thought about posting. It's like, but do I really like? Is that really important enough that I want to post something so that I feel like I have to go back and comment on it? See, that's the other thing that I'm starting to realize. Like I don't know. Maybe it's maybe it's just getting older or whatever. But I don't feel like I want the battle as much as I used to. And when social media becomes a battle, it's like great. Do I really want to put that opinion out there, or do I just want to believe something and not have to defend it all the time? Which in some ways is bad because you should want to defend your positions. But then in some ways, I don't. Like I don't know if you saw. It's quite a few months ago now. Ta-Nehisi Coates very publicly quit Twitter. It was after a heated exchange with Cornell West. They had a very heated exchange. I think it got probably more heated than either of them really wanted to be, and they probably both had that moment where they look back at it, and it's like when you're hungover and you look back at your night of drunkenness, and you're like, wow, that was horrible. And I saw an interview with Coates a few months after where he was asked about why he quit Twitter. And he's like, I can't think on Twitter. Twitter is not a place I can think. I thought I could do it and I can't. I need to digest stuff first and believe things first and then start to think about what the responses would be. But on Twitter, it's instant and you feel like you're just always on your heels. It was really interesting. It was really insightful the way he put it. Um, and I guess I heard that voice in my head when I was thinking, like, do I really need to post that? No, I don't. I don't need to post that anymore. Like, there's something nice about privacy, of internal privacy.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the world would probably be a better place if more people practice that, or some semblance of that. But and I also think it just depends on what your objectives are, right? If in my instance, I look at it as a non-negotiable that I need to be engaged on social media because I'm trying to, not for nothing, start a movement, right? So I'd have to be engaged. I keep thinking about at some point theory of racistness will run out of runway, and so we'll have to hire contractors. And the first thing I wanted to get off of my plate and off of Lakeisha's plate was social media, especially Twitter, But then I
Right.
was like, well, how would that work? Because the person would literally have to be in my brain, be my brain,
Yeah.
be me in
Yeah.
order to talk in a voice that's me. So how would that really work? And I think the only way that could work is if maybe I'm drafting the tweets, but they're the ones replying to comments or something. I don't know. But in my
But
mind,
even then, they'd have to reply in your voice, which would be,
it would be hard depending on the person. Like I know people who could do that, but
yeah,
it's like nobody is me except me. So
right, right.
it's honestly it kind of sucks because um even outside of if it's emotionally draining or anything, it is labor, and it can be, you can, one can get to a place of like the day passes and you realize out of how 12 hours you spent 8 on Twitter,
We've
especially
all done this. We've all done this.
especially on a day like yesterday when the publication came out and I was actually getting attention, and I was like, oh man, I got to try to keep up. It's, first of all, it just gets impossible at some point. You just have to let go and be like, okay, not everyone's going to get a like or a reply or anything like that. Um, and that's okay. You have to let go of some amount of control, but um but yeah, it's time consuming too. So I try to set parameters, and if this comes up in conversation with my students, I would encourage them to do the same thing, to where I'm checking Twitter maybe first thing in the morning and then at the end of the day or something like that, as opposed to constantly. I turn my notifications off because it's a psychological thing. You see that you have 5 outstanding notifications on Twitter or something, and you want to check it, try to keep up with it. And I was like, that's just
Yeah,
a losing game. So I turned the notifications off, with the hope that, and the insight of knowing myself, that that'll help me stay off of it longer.
sure.
Um, but yeah, but then at the same time, I have to look at the sort of return of investment I'm getting, because my objectives are different from yours, and
Mm.
really, I think from the average person's. It's like the engagement is 100% paying off because, like I said, I've been able to grow that account in ways that you can't grow other accounts. I haven't had to spend a single, dollar on Twitter ads or anything like that. And the traffic, the increased traffic to my website, and the way that the traffic is sustained across time, like there's a
Mm.
payoff there. um and
See, Jaron Lanier, I calls that some sort of technological blackmail. He suggests that one of the reasons Twitter is, and just social media in general, is so popular is because even when people don't feel like they would really prefer to be on it, it's sort of like you feel like you need to be on it because that drives traffic.
but
Now, of course, in your case, you say like you do want, like it is worth the investment, but I think like Lanier would say, but that's an investment that keeps people there longer than they would otherwise feel they need to be.
yeah, I think for the average person that's probably the case, and I can't imagine why the average person would need to like increase their traffic or anything, unless you have aspirations to monetize that or any of the platforms that you're on. To me, if I wasn't Theory of Racistness, if I wasn't Dr. Sheena Mason, I would probably be a nomad and just have a Facebook like I used to have, and not be anywhere else, and not be spending a lot of time on Facebook because I don't see the point. I like living my real life instead of living on social media. Um, and it's only because I have these other ambitions of unifying and helping people heal and bringing people together that I put as much time investment as I do into all of
Hmm.
these different platforms. But I think for the average person, that's not the case. They're
Hmm.
not trying to quote unquote change the world or anything like that. They're just trying to be social. And for some people, I think it's an escape from the reality of their lives. And I think it can be a vicious cycle for folks because people live on social media. They put their perfect images of their lives on there, and it gives people the false impression that everyone else's life is perfect, and mine is what life actually is for most people, which is not perfect, right? It's
Yeah.
imperfect, it's trying. And I think the psychological impact that social media has on people, and particularly spending too much time on social media has on people, is definitely detrimental, and something that I think has been studied very well. I think there are compelling arguments out there for why people should probably delete their social media accounts. Um, and at the same time, I think just for businesses, or for like mine, or people who are really trying to affect change, I think the payoff is there. And
Mm.
I wouldn't call that quote unquote blackmail, because I'm a willing participant, and recognizing that we spend a lot of time, especially and really only on Twitter now that we know how it works, uh, because we have an end goal in mind. And for us, the payoff is 100% worth it. It's proving to be worth it. I mean, it's brought
Yeah.
us business, which was the entire point.
Right.
And you can't you can't really have a greater impact if you don't have eyeballs on what you're doing, and Twitter is a great place to do that, to get eyeballs.
Right.
um
Right.
but it's certainly not the be all end all either, because if we were to decide tomorrow, you know what, for whatever reason this is like detrimental to our health or something, we're not going to use our Twitter accounts,
Right.
then we would be okay. Like, we would still find a way. Businesses existed before Twitter, and some businesses blew up and some didn't. Um, Businesses existed before internet and social media. So there's a way to do it, and the sort of, I guess, what has become the traditional way now is social media. There's a way to do it a sort of untraditional or non-traditional way, but I also don't think, at least from my perspective, I don't think there's anything wrong. And I think it's actually more beneficial to keep up with the technology of the times, and to meet people where they are, which is, as we've both, I think, said, on social media.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, right, because Ta-Nehisi Coates can quit Twitter because he's Ta-Nehisi Coates. Like, he already has very big outlets and obviously a very well established name and a well established reach. I think is he still at the Atlantic? I think
I think
he
so.
may have moved on,
But I do know
but
he's at
yeah,
Howard University, which is what I really care
right,
about, because that's
right,
my alma
right,
mater.
right, sure. Yeah, and Jaron Lanier can say all he wants that, oh, you don't need to be on social media to kind of sell books and have a name. Like, look at me. And I'm like, yeah, but you're a tech god. Like, you helped design virtual reality. People know who you are. So one thing I think then that is a little bit of a difference between how you and I kind of view things right now, and maybe one of the reasons why I'm less motivated on social media, is I think my worldview has definitely changed in a certain way. Um, when I started social media, I used to be very well, I guess politically, like, I had a very strong worldview. I was kind of a libertarian kind of guy, very convinced that like there was kind of a right way to do things, and kind of like more willing to, I don't want to say be a crusader, that puts it in a negative light, but I was definitely more willing to be like, someone is wrong on the internet today, I have to do justice. um, and I think my worldview now is a much more kind of pluralistic one, and almost more of a skeptical one. Like, I'm very skeptical of I don't want to say, yeah, I don't want to say right answers, but I'm very skeptical of the idea that the world, that either that right answers exist to certain questions, or that there's a worldview that coherently can order all sorts of right answers together into one big grand picture that we can arrive at if we try really hard. Um, and I found myself, so here's a few situations where I found myself really hating social media. In certain cases, I just don't have a strong opinion about something. I'm just not sold on either side's position. Like, okay, I'll just put it out there. Like, abortion is, I used to be very, very pro choice. I'm still not very like, I'm still not sold on a pro life position, but I don't think there's a knockdown, drag out argument on either side. So whenever I'm on like a pro choice thread, I say, but that's not a fair argument you're using, because a pro lifer can very easily respond to that in the following way. And when I'm on a pro life thread, I do the same sort of thing. Um, or I have a position on a particular thing that is more nuanced than the established sides will allow. I would say with critical race theory and all of the surrounding arguments, I'm that way. So again, it won't be uncommon for me to be on a thread that's very anti critical race theory and say, yeah, but that's not really fair to what critical race theorists generally say. They say the following. And same thing, if I'm on a very pro critical race thread, I can pretty easily see where the cracks are there. And then the third is where I have strong opinions, but from issue A to issue B to issue C, I don't align with an established tribe. And in those three situations, which are becoming more and more of the situations for me, it gets really hard. So it gets really hard to like, because basically I end up seeing every thread is like a call to collectively worship, and all the comments are a collective worship where everyone worships together. And then coming into that and disrupting it is almost like being the atheist who goes into a church and says there is no God, and expecting people to treat you kindly.
Yeah, I'm just wondering where you see the differences, because everything you just said, it sounds like me. So,
Yeah, I guess the difference is, well, I wrote an article recently for the Electric Agora called the Activist and the Skeptic," and I think I've told you about the situation. I won't mention names, but I was talking with a professor, and we were talking about our teaching, and we were talking about I was talking about a particular class that I had where we were talking about an issue that this professor cares a lot about. And I said, yeah, we read this article that I think you'd really like, and we had a really great discussion on it. You should have heard it. Oh, in next class, I'm going to present the opposite side. I'm going to present something that disagrees with that. And the professor looked at me kind of like, this is where like her head nodding kind of stopped and said, you're gonna present something opposing the right side of of things. She didn't really say it quite that way, and I was like, yeah, because and the professor, if I were to kind of summon her voice, would say, Kevin, you're being irresponsible. There's a right side of this issue and there's a wrong side. And you're going to present the wrong side and you're not going to call it out as the wrong side. And students are probably already predisposed to believe that wrong side because that wrong side allegedly is everywhere. So you are basically abdicating your role as teaching these students what the right side of this is. And you're going to quote unquote allow them to think for themselves. But what that really means is you're not going to have the guts to defend the right side of this. Um, And I was like, oh man, all right. So I wrote this article because I really think that I am more and more skeptical of people who think that there is a correct position to come to and they know what it is. And probably to a lot of folks, that sounds like it's kind of a cop out. Maybe it is. Maybe that subconsciously it is. I don't know. But I'm more and more skeptical of folks who really see the world in that sort of what I would say is, and I'm not saying this about you, but I would say some activists I know of see the world in a much more simple terms than I'm willing to see it. Um,
you know what's interesting? So, I tell my students, I found myself repeating more than once this semester because I wanted to, as professors can often do, because I wanted to make sure they heard me
mm,
when I said it right. I found myself saying something to the effect of, "Remember that last time when I was saying how two people can be right at the same time but have the exact opposite beliefs?" And I explained how de- depending on where a person is in their learning and what kind of knowledge and experience and all the things they have, they can really believe that they're right about something. And in that way, they're right about the thing that they think they're right about, because based on what they know and what they've experienced and how they see things, they're right. And I was like, but you could just as easily come into contact with somebody like me who has this other knowledge that that other person doesn't have, and for all intents and purposes I'm right. And I was like, so we can both be right, and there might technically be a capital R right, there's a capital T truth, right? um that could be the case, but that doesn't make you wrong, or that doesn't make them wrong in the this fake scenario that I was like giving them. Because ultimately I think what is rotting away the sort of underpinnings of our society, and that's probably an exaggeration, but I'm gonna go with it with the hyperbole here. I think what's rotting um away is like the willingness and capacity to see a human on the other side of whatever the thing is, because as we were
Mhm.
talking about earlier, and this kind of brings us 360, is like people are so quick to demonize and make monsters of people who think differently and disagree with whatever the fundamental point is. And I think that is an atrocious way to see oneself and to see other people and to see fellow man. So part of why I actually agree with you and think it's interesting that you see us as perhaps being different in those fundamental ways is like part of my work through theory of racistness and as an educator is precisely what you're saying. Is like it is my inability to see another human being as a monster or a devil or as even necessarily wrong, even though wink wink I know I'm right. um i think I think one can know they're right about a thing based on the knowledge and the experience that they have, but still treat other people with love and compassion and as if and with the understanding that as far as that person's concerned, they're right. And I think if we can get to a place where more people are encouraged to see themselves and other people in that way, I don't think from my perspective, what I'm trying to say is I don't think that means that we have to walk around not having convictions about any particular thing or not recognizing when we are right about a particular thing. But I think that we can be right and not be dismissive and not devalue other human beings based on the beliefs that they express and based on the knowledge they have or don't have or aren't privy
Right.
to. And
So
I
yeah.
think I'm sorry. And the last thing I'll say is like I think that we do ourselves a disservice we don't when we don't confront for ourselves other voices, as I was saying earlier, and when we don't help our students confront other voices, just in the example that you gave, because again, it's a matter of testing one's ideas. And if you truly believe in your ideas, in the quote unquote rightness or goodness of your ideas, then you can be confronted with any amount of, evidence and perspective coming from the quote unquote other side and still feel confident in your own ideas. But if you never get confronted with the other side, then I think that that is ultimately the sort of coward's way out, because
Yeah.
and it's showing that you view your ideas as having an Achilles heel. So instead of exposing the Achilles heel by presenting this other information, we're just going to hide the other information. I think that that is how
Mm.
we get to the quagmires that we're in today as a society, and it's all detrimental to our own humanity and our ability to recognize the humanity in our brothers and sisters, and
Yeah.
that's all bad.
Yeah, I think maybe the difference is that, and maybe it's not a difference, but this would take us in a whole different direction that I don't know if we want to go down. But I mean, by worldview, I guess I'm sort of, you could say, fairly close to being a postmodernist. So I definitely agree with you that like we obviously don't want to lose seeing the humanity in the other side and the plausibility of other perspectives. But in a lot of cases, I don't believe that there is that capital T truth that other people are convinced of. I believe that there's like, is there a way the world is? Yes. Can we know it outside of our interpretations that are always perspectival? No. So I guess when I see folks talking about, um, like, no, this is a really simple issue. Like, it's very clear that this is the right way it is. At that point, that's an opportunity for me to say, do I really want to engage with this person? Um, because I don't think that a lot of the things that folks say really are this is just an obvious matter of fact. Like, nothing's an obvious matter of fact. Fact is always dependent on how we interpret the things. Um, so, like with the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, I think I was probably right where you were. I didn't really follow the trial that much, and I'm very honest about, like, I just had other things going on at the time, and obviously I know that nothing I say is going to make the outcome any different than what, like, that's the jury, that's not me. So I saw a whole bunch of people on different sides saying it's so obvious that dot dot dot. The other side, like, it's so obvious that dot dot dot. And I'm like, does Johnny Cochran was absolutely right when he said trials are about interpretations. Trials are about who can weave the narrative that's the most compelling around these data points. So I felt like I couldn't engage with either side because that's what I would say. It's like, okay, but what you're saying is a clear matter of fact is a data point, and different interpretations around that data point are possible. So have you ever entertained the other side of this thing? Um, and I found that, like, in in really all cases, there was no counterexample. No one was willing to follow me there. Folks on the left would say, "How dare you? Why would you ever entertain that this guy was acting in self-defense?" And folks on the right were like, "How dare you? Why would you ever entertain that this whole thing was an example of a white supremacist showing up and knowing he was going to use a gun?" It's like, that's it. I'm out. I can't do
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, no, I think we're um 100% more in agreement than is readily apparent to you, because
Hmm.
I'm in my own brain, so I know I can see the similarities. Um because that's how I view myself and in all matters. To the point of, you know, I don't just practice what I preach, I question my own ideas. I'm constantly in search for capital T truth. I think that we can't necessarily, I think that there are some instances where there is a capital T truth, and that's rooted in material reality. That I do think is true. uh but I also think that for most things and for most matters, we can be on a quest for capital T truth, but we can't ever necessarily know the truth. Or if we know the truth, we can't ever necessarily know that we know that we know
Right.
that we've
Right.
arrived,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And so for me, I'm constantly on a quest for capital T truth, because I'm just trying to get as close as I can to the thing. And I think
Yeah.
in being able to recognize and help other people do the same thing and think similarly, and recognize that um that the world is, in what we consider to be knowledge, is far more complex and nuanced than we are taught to believe. I think that that is a recognition and a sort and a type of knowledge that's for the betterment of our human society. And I think the ways that people have and continue to cast the world in this sort of black and white way, pun intended, theory of racistness, um, I think that is ultimately reflective of the same thing that I'm helping people out of, which is where my skepticism as it pertains to race comes into play. And it's why it's at the core of why I help people work toward eliminativism, even if they don't jive with the skepticism, because they can be
Hmm.
constructionists and be an eliminativist. Because ultimately, one can look at the elimination part as a desire to eliminate the black and white ways of thinking that people think exist and see the world through, but that don't actually, I don't think is actually grounded in reality. I think the world is gray, right? More often than not, I think it's gray, which speaks to my concession that indeed the capital T truth, it's a sort of lifelong journey that one goes on, right? um
Right.
I want to mention my favorite author.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Percival Everett. Have you read anything by Percival
Mm-mm.
Everett?
No.
I feel like I've probably told you about him before too, because he is my favorite. So he's a professor at the University of Southern California. He teaches creative writing, and the first book I read by him was a book called Erasure. Recently, as in this week, we read Telephone in one of my classes, his 2020 publication. Um, in the book Telephone, he has three different versions, and the way you know which version you have, on the cover of the book there are three images of a hand holding a compass, and the top compass will be in a different position. The needle will be pointing in a different direction. That's how you know which book you have. And
Hmm.
each book has slight modifications to the plot. And
Interesting.
the way that he writes is very postmodern, so very avant-garde and very much precluding you from knowing everything about the book. The
Right.
protagonist is
Yeah.
unreliable. He uses like six different languages, like Italian, French, Spanish, English, Latin, like all the things. He's The protagonist is a paleontologist, so he has like random paleontology and geology stuff interlaced throughout, and you don't know, if you're not in that field, you don't know if it's real or if he's faking paleontology or what it is. And you just have to go look it up. Sometimes a single line, it'll be a name of a painting, because in the book they go to the Louvre in Paris, and he'll just name a painting, and it has to do with the storyline. But like, if you're unfamiliar with the painting or you don't take the time to go look it up, you're not going to know. So there's so many ways in which, to me, the sort of message of, and then when I think of the game Telephone, right, this idea that at the start a message is a certain thing, but as it goes down the line it gets obscured. So the capital T truth gets obscured, but every single person will be convinced that they're relaying the right message.
Right.
And every single person will be convinced then that they are right and in the know. And it's not until you get to the end and then you share, like, how did it start versus how did it end, that one can know the differences and the nuances and how it changed, right?
Yeah.
So I think of that and I'm like, it's brilliant and it's timely. And part of my fascination and love for him is because he precludes us from really knowing that he's a type of writer that ends this story really at the beginning, so you really don't know like what happens. It can be irritating,
Yeah.
but it's also like, it's just so brilliant.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's how I people talk a lot of smack about postmodernity. I think the people who talk a lot of smack about it probably know the least about what it is. But as a literary scholar, I have a deep appreciation for it, because postmodernity, literary movements, all the things, um, I think that that's naturally how my brain has been encouraged to see things and to look at things and to help me see beyond the black and white ultimately.
Yeah.
So I think it's a tool that could be useful for more people.
Yeah, I'm glad we're kind of foraying into this actually, because I've been thinking myself, I'm very influenced by I think Richard Rorty is probably one of the philosophers I identify with most, and he was pretty comfortable with the label postmodern. Gianni Vattimo, the Italian philosopher, is another, and really both of them said um, they have very similar thought patterns. They basically say, yes, there's a world. There's a world that's independent of us. We don't just make up things arbitrarily. We can be wrong in our beliefs, but we can't know what that world is without interpretation. So whenever you get into interpretative disagreements, the tendency is to say, well, what really happened? Why don't we get to what really happened? Let's figure out some unbiased way to get to what really happened. And they said, like, yeah, there's such a thing as being less biased in your life, and you should try to do that. But what that doesn't do is lead you to an account of what really happened. Right? There's no, let's give up on that idea. You can, the best we can do is get to beliefs that work and work better in practice, but we can't really undo interpretation. And I guess, like, when I go back and read Rorty and Vattimo, one of my thoughts is that it's funny because the critique of postmodernism is that it's too illiberal. It leads to illiberalism. And my concern is that maybe it was too liberal, because Vattimo and Rorty, and I think if you look at Leotard and those, they all said, like, it's all interpretation, and what this means is that we all need to get really comfortable with difference, and we all need to become really kind of aware that our thought is partial, and that we should all be kind of less dogmatic about it. We should allow for differences in interpretation. And it's like, I feel like the social media world has given us, they predicted the social media world, that we would all kind of that interpretation would kind of flourish, that we can't really monopolize thought anymore. We can't territorialize it anymore. But what happened with that is the opposite of what they thought would happen. We didn't become more tolerant of difference. We didn't become less strong and less strident in our beliefs. We became more strident in our beliefs. And I wonder, my theory is that we are more a believing animal than the postmodernists and really all of Western philosophy gave us credit for. So Aristotle said we are the rational animal. What distinguishes us from the lower beasts, if you will, is that we are the rational animal. We're capable of rational thought. I think that's correct. But I think if you look at what really distinguishes us from my cat at home, let's say, is that we're the believing animal. My cat doesn't form beliefs in the way that humans form beliefs. So I feel like what postmodernity did is it divested us of the ability to think that our beliefs just are uncontested truths. But what happened is that we want to believe so much. We want things to believe that when we fall into that sort of skepticism, we just dig in our heels. Postmodernists thought we would just be confronted with all of this kind of opposing interpretation and be like, oh, maybe we shouldn't believe so hard. But what we really did was we dug in our heels and said, no, I need to believe something. So I'm going to believe something strongly. I
Yeah.
don't know if that makes sense to you, but it just, if I think about what like postmodernists predicted what was happening, they predicted this ideological factionization and that you can't monopolize truth. But I just think they were maybe naive about what the results of that would be.
Yeah, because that also in my mind brings us 360 to the response to the publication.
Mm,
And when more eyeballs get to it, then that's when people start publicly digging in their heels, right? Because ultimately ultimately the way racialist ideology works is to keep people in black and white categories, pun intended. And when the when people have gone outside the bounds, then they automatically get accused of being, white supremacist or anti-black or racist or whatever, and that's supposed to encourage the person to go back in the box. Um, I think that I think that the fact that certain polls show that people think that America is more racist now than ever before, things like that show to me that that's exactly right. What you're saying is that we have in a lot of ways doubled and quadrupled and tripled down on certain ideas and certain ways of being and seeing the world, such that there's at least a nominal amount of resistance to ideas that dispel those kinds of neat notions and qualifications. And I still think that a world in which the philosophers you named described or imagined coming into fruition is the sort of ideal goal in a lot of ways, if we're talking about goals and sort of hopeful outcomes, because the world that they imagined coming into fruition is a world that is not tolerant, because I think that's actually a pejorative way of looking at things, but I think accepting and embracing of all of these different ways of being and seeing the world. And from my perspective, it's hard for people to really understand this, but from my perspective, that means also knowing and accepting and embracing the fact, for example, that some people are going to be racist, that we cannot blot out from the earth or from this country or from any community all racism. I think that, and I think one of the things that we've talked about briefly before is like, I really get the distinct impression that many people have sort of absolutes and absolute truths in their minds when it comes to certain ends, and they want to get there by any means. But they really think that, oh yeah, we can get to a place where 0% of people are racist. There are 0% incidents of racism. But in my mind, I'm like, no, that's not the goal. The person who
mm,
came to me at Twitter and called me anti-black, and I'm just writing to white people. The irony, um, that person, I don't feel compelled to engage with them. I said, bless your heart. That's it. That's my go-to like wording. I don't feel compelled to engage with them unless they come to me in a more meaningful and sincere way. But I don't feel compelled to be, no, you have to see the world differently, free yourself, all this sort of stuff, because it's like, how condescending is that? But also, it's a fallacy that I'm not willing to let myself subscribe to. This belief that everyone has to see the world this way, even though, not for nothing, Kevin, I know this is a more liberatory way for people to see the world and a more unifying way for people to see the world. It's not my intent to get every single person to do it, because I know that's not how humans work.
Right.
And I think, it's not that I embrace bigotry or hope for racist things to happen or feel happy when they do happen. It's just more of an acknowledgement of like, human society is imperfect. We will never be perfect. So I don't think the goal should be perfection. And as great as it would be, that's like saying America needs to get the number of murder victims down to zero. It's an admirable goal, but that's not how human society works,
Right.
um and as a philosopher and as somebody who's trained in literary studies, um I think that our interests are very, very much aligned, for all of the reasons I've expressed. And
Yeah.
I would want, I would want to just point out that I don't feel, just as I don't feel inclined to respond to the naysayer on Twitter, I don't actually feel inclined to engage with people who say certain things, or the pro or the anti, the for or the against. I don't feel inclined to actually engage in those kinds of conversations in the same ways you don't feel inclined to engage. And so I don't. I focus on putting out information and knowledge and educating people. And if people feel compelled to respond to me and it seems like, they're coming from a sincere place, or it's something quick and easy, like mistaking race for with ethnicity, for example, then I will go the extra mile and I'll reply and I'll say, well, actually, da 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 da, and I'll give an explanation. But I don't get in, social media wars. I don't recommend other people get in social media wars. I don't, the Rittenhouse and stuff, the Ahmaud Arbery case. I've been completely silent until recently. A podcaster asked me about it. Been completely silent because I'm not. It's not even just that I don't um, necessarily feel strongly either way. Admittedly, with
Right.
Rittenhouse, I think the right decision was made. So in that case, I do feel strongly that the right decision was made, because based on my knowledge of the case, I think it was self-defense, and so it's that easy for me. With Ahmaud Arbery, it's sort of the same thing. Based on my knowledge of the case, I think the right decision was made. Those men were guilty, right?
The funny
Um,
thing is people are going to wonder how like you can hold those two at the same time, right? Because if you're a political conservative, you're supposed to, it's remarkable that political conservatives will almost always come out on the side of like if they're on the side of like the way you would expect a conservative to come out, and political progressives, let's say, on the other side. So it's,
but
I
I'm
would say
not. But
like,
people don't know my politics
right, right,
because I'm
that's
not
true,
a
that's
political
true,
conservative.
right,
And
right. No,
so,
that's what I'm saying. It's going to jam people up. It's going to be like, oh, wait a minute, but didn't you come down in here? But on this other case, why are you?
yeah,
You're like,
guess what?
I'm
Because
not on your tribe. Right.
I'm always in search for the capital T truth, whether we want to think it exists or it doesn't. I try to look at things as unbiased as possible. I think that is the key, and that is something that people don't really aspire to do. The emphasis as unbiased as possible, and very few people are able to look at certain information, certain set of data, and have an unbiased interpretation of that same data. That's why we have some of the nonsensical discourse happening and battles happening now in the public sphere, because everyone is coming to the same information with an agenda more often than not, right? Um and in that way, everything is filtered through a certain way of viewing the world, and that might be cynical, just as you said of yourself. That might be cynical, but I think it's not for nothing, I think it's also true. It's reality. Um and at least my efforts, and when I do engage like on Twitter, it really is to help and present people with an alternative way of thinking about themselves and the world, and just educating them about it. It's not to convince or persuade, it's not to strong arm, it's not to guilt trip. It's like, literally, here's an alternative to those two ways that you think exist are the only two ways. Here's a third alternative way to do the thing that gives more people what they want. And is it a perfect solution? No. Does it have to be a perfect solution? No. So people should stop. I think people should really stop convincing themselves that there's only one or two ways to do anything, or only one or two ways to think about a thing, and encourage people and themselves to question everything, to force yourself to engage in dialogue, or not even dialogue, but engage with information that you think you disagree with, to help your own thinking skills and things like that. And the world would look vastly different. It would look certainly a lot closer to the image that the philosophers had in mind when they were thinking about the future. And I think if more of us were coming from that sort of skeptical positionality, and if more of us recognize the fact that so long as we have human beings, we're never going to agree 100% on anything, and that the world is far more complicated than we pretend that it is, and that's okay, because our attempts to order things actually create more disorder. um I think we can actually get somewhere. And I feel heartened, and this also inspires my optimism. I feel heartened by the response that I get through my work and from my students. It's overwhelmingly positive, and so that also helps me stay positive, and it also helps
Yeah.
me know which battles to pursue and which ones to not pursue.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm tempted to kind of go to it's ironic that my motivation to use social media has decreased the more I've become a skeptic in certain ways, of kind of the capital T version of truth. But like, there's a philosopher that I've been kind of recently going back and rereading, a Peronian skeptic named Sextus Empiricus, who was kind of a proponent of the idea that one should try to stay away from firm beliefs, and the best way to do that was to try to keep accounts on all sides. If you think that like you're getting too firm in this one category, go out and kind of seek the other position and try to keep them equal in your brain. Um, Now, of course, that itself is hard work, and that itself can ironically become a sort of dogmatism. It's like the dogmatism of always be open minded to everything at all times. But it's like this tension that I feel between belief and skepticism. And I think that this is like probably the final resting place for like where I come down at the end of the day. It's like there's this polarity that we have in our heads, probably always, between we want to believe stuff. We can't just be open minded about everything. We always want to believe stuff. It's doubt is uncomfortable, belief is comfortable. But then there's this pull on the other side where we don't, we want to maintain skepticism. And I just struggle with this polarity between in myself. I feel it, of course. I want to believe things, even though I know that I don't want to become too firm in beliefs. It always ends up happening that some beliefs calcify over time. But then I want to go the other way, which is skepticism. Maybe I should open it up a little bit, become more like Sextus Empiricus. But of course, you can't live life all on that end either. Like, you have to believe certain things just to get through our days. We're acting beings. We're partial, and our partiality, it leads to belief. So it's like this push and pull, and I feel like the more I try to go in that social media direction, the more I'm pulled toward that belief side.
Mm.
And I'm trying to
Oh, I
maintain
see.
that balance between those. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, that's so we have kind of similar fears, with some slight modifications. So I've become really practiced at exposing myself to ideas that I used to think I couldn't see any value in. Truly.
well,
It was
I mean, it's worth noting, by the way, before, sorry to interrupt, but you have changed your mind, so you know what this feels like, right? Because
Oh,
you used to
absolutely.
be very, you would the prior Sheena would have scoffed at the idea of racelessness, right? And then you kind of read more and read more and read more.
Yeah.
So, but
I probably wouldn't have scoffed, because I think I've always had, I, I've grown certainly, but I've always had the ability to see things. I've always seen things differently, and that way I've been an outsider always. So even though I still was a constructionist, reconstructionist, as most Americans are taught to be, I still saw things very differently, which is how my brain got to where it is now.
But like you had to
Um,
rewrite. I mean, you had to recalibrate your dissertation, didn't you? If
no,
I were, oh, okay. I
no,
thought at some point you said like you did research and you realized that maybe like you were on the wrong track and you should recalibrate your argument. Or I thought I remember.
no. One of my advisors um, wanted to gently push me into a different direction away from the
I see.
idea of racelessness,
I see. Yeah.
away from the idea of racelessness, but I refused because that was my idea.
Yeah.
And so I wasn't going to do it to appease, I wasn't going to change that to appease anyone, even recognizing that a dissertation, the best dissertation is a done dissertation, then you can go and do whatever you want in theory. I was like, no, I'm going to make this case as compelling as I can. Then it was fine. I passed with distinction. Um, but so I've become very practiced at finding other voices, right, and presenting myself with information and ideas that initially or a few years ago I would have had a really hard time presenting myself with, because it's about emotions. You get angry, right, or you get defensive, or you just get sort of indignant, like, oh my gosh, how can these people say these things, and how can they say it in that way, and things like that. But I became very practiced at presenting myself with that information. And there have been countless times, especially at the earlier stages of my work, where I would ask myself and have this fear of, like, am I the thing that I'm professing to try to solve, right? Am I racist? Not am I racist, but are my ideas racist? That was
Hmm.
really at the core of what I was asking, right?
Right.
Am I in the trap? The same trap I'm identifying for other people as being in, am I in the trap? um and 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 I've never been afraid to ask people, including my advisor never for a second hesitated or thought that I was racist or my ideas were racist, or even that they were bad or misguided or anything like that. It was like she was really coming from the perspective of, uh am I going to have a career on the other end of the PhD? Because to her mind, talking about eliminativism and racelessness and stuff like that, it was not going to get me a job. And she's like, once you get a job and you get in there, then you can start writing the things ostensibly that you were really interested in and you want to write. That
Of
was her
course, that's not true. They're going to tell you to wait for tenure.
that
Like
that
six
was
years later, you can. Yeah.
that was her concern, and it was a right concern, and I understood and, like, appreciated the concern, right? But it turned out to also not be the case, largely because I had become so skilled at figuring out how to package the information to land well on more ears than not. And so when I show up to my job talk and I present my research, they're fascinated by it. They're not scared. They're not like, is this the wrong idea? Like, what's going on here? Everyone knows about theory of racelessness. It's my first semester as a professor. It's not hidden. I shared the Free Journal of Free Black Thought essay with everyone yesterday. I got so many compliments and all this other positive feedback. So it's like literally the exact opposite reaction of what people expect,
Mm-hmm.
which also gives me hope that people aren't, speaking of nuance and speaking of gray, that they're not, that what I think and see about people as being and inhabiting the gray space in the sort of center more often than not is true, because it's proving to be true in my own life.
Yeah.
um but also, but really at the core of what I was trying to say just now is this fact that I also am constantly and almost incessantly and probably obnoxiously always questioning my own ideas and always asking the hard questions of myself. I ask my wife, are we wrong though? Like,
Mm-hmm.
are we wrong about this? Like, am I doing good work? Before theory of racistness really started picking up, I was asking friends. I mean, I'm asking anyone who will listen. who I know their hearts, and they wouldn't say something just because they're trying to like keep me down, right?
Right.
Um, and you know, sometimes I wish I didn't have that much skepticism or that much ability to like question my own ideas in some ways, to practice what I preach, because sometimes I just want to feel confident about my ideas, right? Like there's some power in that. But at the same time, because I'm constantly researching, including doing research on Twitter and elsewhere, because I'm constantly open to the possibility of being wrong, because found myself to be wrong along the way, which is how I've had this extreme intellectual and emotional growth. Um, that value and those benefits far outweigh the fact that I'm constantly asking myself, like, am I wrong?
Hmm. Yeah.
And I would rather find out that I'm wrong. Some of the things I've been wrong about have been happy wrongs, right? Like the pervasiveness of racism, for example. When I used to think of systemic racism, I used to have particular ideas in my head. I came to find out within the last 30 days even that some of those ideas were wrong.
Hmm.
And it was hard to be wrong in some senses, because I think it's hard to be wrong for most people. But at the same time, what I disproved even for myself by accident, um, it was actually a good discovery
Yeah.
of like the reality and stuff like that. So I'm actually happier and better for knowing that information, as opposed to having this particular image or ideas in my brain. So so like you, I also work to keep a sort of healthy balance, because I don't want to drive myself crazy, always be like, am I wrong? Am I racist? Am I doing the wrong thing? But at the same time, I think if more people operated from that place, I just think of how much kinder people would be toward each other, and how much less anger and divisiveness and hate there could be, because ultimately I think it's people's inability or unwillingness to do just that that causes part of the problems. And this has also required a certain amount of trust in myself too. And like you were saying, you kind of worry about falling into the same trap that your skepticism wants to keep you from, which is having certain beliefs, or having beliefs in such a manner that's like the antithesis of how your skepticism really would encourage you to work. And for me, it's like there part of my questioning, part of my skepticism was inflamed or increased by the fact that I was presenting myself with voices that I believe were fundamentally wrong about certain
Hmm.
things or in certain ways. And so then I feared becoming what I'm listening to, right? In a
Yeah.
way. And it's so, it's it is
Yeah.
funny. There is some humor to it. But I did have a fear. Like admittedly, one of my fears for a long time was, am I a conservative? Am I becoming conservative? Like,
Right.
which is such a strange thing to fear. But when you're living in a society that basically programs you to think that conservatives are the devil, then if you start to feel that you're vibing with like conservative voices and stuff, there's a fear that comes with that for
Yeah.
some people, right? There's a strong pride for other people, but a fear for other people. And so that was a fear, and I had to grapple with that and recognize my own sort of like humanity and faulty thinking when it comes to like, what do I think about conservatives and things like that? What does it mean to be conservative? All of those things. But it was, admittedly, it was like that was my reality at different points of my journey. And but I think I'm better for it. I think I'm better
Hmm.
for it because the sort of insight that I gained from my own process helps me have more empathy and compassion for other humans, for other people who are going through similar things or who have such strong beliefs. And the only thing I've become firmer in believing really is that um, what we think is true about what most people think is true about racism isn't true. That even I haven't arrived at the fullest truth, but I do feel like I'm at a version of truth that if more people learned about it, the world would be a better place and more
Yeah.
people would be happy and we'd be more together than divided.
Hmm. I think we should probably stop there, leave it there. Then, anything else that that you want to say before we sign off?
Just that I'm always glad to talk with you, Kevin. I really enjoy
Yeah,
talking with you. I learn a lot from
I
you,
feel
and
the same.
I feel like we have really interesting conversations. So it's glad to be off of
Yeah.
Twitter and and in this conversation with you. And I
I
look
don't know.
forward
I
to
mean, like
talking more.
you're tempting me to reopen an account, but I'll have to think about it long and hard before. But needless to say, I feel the same, and I can't wait for the next one.
Yeah, same
So,
here. Thank you so much.
all right, Sheena Mason, good to talk to you.
You too. Bye bye.